So, hello and welcome, everyone. We are so excited to have you all here to join us for Neuro and Ethics, the December and final Neuro and webinar of the year. I'm so excited to introduce our wonderful speakers for today's monthly webinar. So, please welcome Nicole Martinez-Martin and Sara Goering. Dr. Martinez-Martin is an assistant professor at Stanford Center for Biomedical Ethics with a background in law and social sciences. Her research explores the ethics of AI and digital health technologies, particularly their impact on marginalized communities. She has led projects on machine learning in healthcare, digital phenotyping, and digital contact tracing, funded by an NIMH K01 grant. Dr. Goering is a professor of philosophy at the University of Washington and core faculty in the Ethics and Disability Studies program. Her research focuses on the ethics of biomedical and neural technologies, especially brain-computer interfaces and the perspectives of people with disabilities. As co-PI for the NSF-funded Center for Neurotechnology, she leads efforts to integrate ethics into neuroengineering. All right, Nicole, I'm going to hand it off to you here if you want to tell us a little bit more about your career journey and experiences and start us off.
Sure. I have some slides to share, and um, while, let's see. While they're up, it's hard for me to see the chat. So just if there
Mhm.
is something where it seems like it makes sense, to jump in, please feel free to do so. But just know I might not be able to see into the chat. And thank you so much, Irene, for inviting me. Thank you, for Dana Foundation as well for, helping to put this together. And I really appreciate this opportunity, especially, with Dr. Being able to be here with Dr. Goering, whose work I very much respect, and I appreciate the chance to be part of this conversation. So I'm going to start off just more talking about some of my path. I've always been interested in questions that have to do with, this interaction between how people think, how people sort of make sense of the world around them, and this interaction with culture. And that started with undergrad, that I was an anthropology major, and anthropology, being the study of people and culture. But many times within anthropology, I often, gravitated towards the type of anthropology that really looks at this interaction between how people perceive the world, how people, go have ways of thinking and perception that are influenced by culture. Nonetheless, when I decided, what I wanted to do after college, I decided to do a law degree, and I went to, Harvard Law School. I was interested, mainly I went there, thinking that I wanted to do something that was, helpful, helpful to society. Did some work during law school itself. I did some work in criminal defense. So after I left, I also did work in legal aid, and just to explain, legal aid is generally for people who can't afford an attorney, and having a place where they might be able to go for questions with, for example, housing, and or family law, divorces, etc. And the reason why I'm bringing this up is because what happened, and this is going to be sort of one of the themes I am going to get back to, just as you all are embarking, on more and more on your journeys, is that I began to really notice what is it that really interests me in what I'm doing. I know, broadly speaking, I want to, I want to be doing stuff that's of benefit to society. I'm really interested in like how people's minds work. And so, that's where I would really emphasize paying attention as you're, going through your world, paying attention to what are the things that really sort of grab you, that as you're going about, whether it's your classes, whether it's, additional like extracurriculars, what are the questions that you keep coming back to again and again? And for me, even as I was working in the law, one of the things that I really kept coming back to was that I was encountering people who had mental health issues. This is particularly the case in the criminal justice system, that somewhere around 15 to 20% of people who are defendants in the criminal justice system have severe mental illness, somewhere around 15 to 20%, which is much higher than in the general population. And it shows you how there's this interaction between, people who are, going through severe mental health issues and criminal justice system. But what I really want to underline here is it's not at all to do with having a higher propensity towards crime. It's really that there are not sufficient support or resources in our society for if people are going through mental health issues, that they have housing, that they have support for somewhere to live, a way to go about getting their medications, a way to go about getting their food. And what many of the people who have mental health disorders who end up in the criminal justice system, it is not for violent crimes. It is, not for, not for these sort of bigger crimes, but it's for things like, being homeless, for not having a home. And so being, on the street in places where it's been made illegal for them to be. Or it is, things like, if they are, having trouble getting money for, whether it's medication or otherwise, that it might be, petty crime in some instances. But it's really, and again, I really want to emphasize this for not giving the wrong impression, that, it's really about a lack of, having sufficient ways in our society to support and help people who are going through, mental health crises. I also, when I was helping in legal aid, I also found that there were a number of people that, were going through a lot of different problems, and mental illness was, sort of one thing on top of it that made it just that much harder for them to keep their home, or that much harder for them to, be in a, domestic relationship, or that kind of thing. And so, so just to underline here, noticing this, I noticed that I kept coming back again and again that I really wanted to know more. I really was interested in what was happening in mental health in the United States. And so that's why I decided to go to graduate school. And the graduate school I went to is University of Chicago. And it was an interdisciplinary program called Comparative Human Development. And the idea of it is the mind and social context, as in, as important, there's many different ways of approaching neuroscience, for example. And this particular program was really interested in what is the interaction that, when you have mental illness, you certainly have something biological happening. And these are things that, again, are still being studied and better understood. But it can be differences in structures of the brain. It can be differences in, chemicals like dopamine, serotonin, that impact mental health. But it's also an interaction with society, that if, for example, someone is hearing voices, there may be different ways that that ends up expressing itself because of how the society around them reacts and responds to it. That, there may be some societies where there's a little bit more of a space for people who are in that, particular situation of hearing voices, that maybe they're still able to be, supported within their family, or that, they're given a different context, that, these voices have, whether it's a spiritual role or otherwise. And, that's just one of many examples of how there is this interaction then between your context, between your culture and environment, and what might be happening biologically in your brain. And so that's where I went, in terms of, being interested in, exploring more, understanding more about mental health. And in particular, I would say, one of the experiences that really led me in that direction was when I was interning doing criminal defense work. There was one client that I had who had schizophrenia. And, because of that, situation, they ended up, not having a home, that, they would go periods of time not being on their medications. And, again, that this often gets misunderstood, people going off their medications. But sometimes when people are on, especially something like schizophrenia, the medications have a number of side effects. And so, those side effects can be that it, makes, changes in their sort of motor, that they have movements that they can't control, that their mouth gets really dry, that even though, the medication might help control, some of their symptoms of schizophrenia, it also may create new symptoms like feeling cloudy headed and not feeling like themselves. And so, there's a number of reasons why people might go off their medications, but this particular client, hadn't had a home, didn't have a, hadn't been on their medications, and they were caught in an office building that they had gone into one of the offices. And when someone saw them, in the conference room of their office, they called the police and said that, this person was trespassing, trying to steal. And so, I was assigned to help out with defending this client. And it was really instructive because, first of all, it was seeing that, this person who had schizophrenia, they were very likely to become a victim of violence in jail. And so it really became a priority. What can we do to get this person out of jail? Because, there's a good chance that they would get beaten up or otherwise hurt in jail. And then when I went to, look into, well, what are our options, that there was an option where they could plead not guilty as long as we found them, some housing and a treatment program. That's when and I was new to this, that's when I really found out how incredibly hard it is to find treatment programs for people, finding a bed, finding a place where they can go. And then, finally, the one thing we needed to do, I finally found the bed for them. I finally found a treatment program that would take them. And then we had to ask this client of mine, we had to ask them that they would they say that they were guilty in order to then receive this, it's called kind of an alternative sentence. Instead of going to jail, he could just go to his treatment program. And it it was so distressing for him because the one thing that he really thought he still had was his dignity, that he wasn't a thief. And so we had to spend all this time convincing him that it would be for the best. And when I saw how distressed he was, again, it was this real lesson to me of just how our society handles these things, that we couldn't just find this person a treatment program. We had to have this person say something that was very distressing to them, something that I really don't think he himself believed, that he was guilty of trying to steal something. But we were able to finally, have him have some minimal agreement to that. He went into treatment, at least stayed in treatment for a while that I was able to find out. But that's what really, in sort of paying attention to what was of interest to me, what in what I was doing, what were things that I can contribute. That's where I became then interested, both in where I went into a graduate program to learn more, but also this really took me down this path of neuroethics. And there are a lot of different ways to, describe neuroethics. But one of the things is simply looking at that, when you have neurosciences, when you have neurotechnologies, that obviously there's a lot of benefit that they can give. But there's also different implications of it. What are things that you need to attend to in order to see that, the neuroscience is conducted responsibly in a way that will benefit society and people? What are the ways of developing and implementing neurotechnologies in ways that you can think of, will these benefit society? What are the potential harms and what can we do about them? And with something like neuroethics, there's not a magic formula that you can simply plug in, but it's a system of thinking. What are processes for thinking through what are the ways to ethically go about whether it's conducting neuroscience research, implementing neurotechnologies, so that we can think through, what are the balances of benefits, what are the potential risks, what are ways of addressing those risks, so that they can be addressed, hopefully, through policy or otherwise. So one of my first projects, in sort of bringing together things that I was interested in, was applying neuroscience in criminal courts. But then, as I came to Stanford, to Silicon Valley, there was a lot of work going on in digital mental health, whether that's apps, AI, virtual care, or otherwise. And, as I said, part of my interest, or a big part of my interest, is how our society deals with mental illness. And I thought that it was really interesting the kind of benefits that could come from digital mental health or AI applications for improving treatment, for improving diagnosis. But also recognize that, if some of the potential ethical questions about them weren't addressed, that they could also create additional problems. And I'll talk more about that in a moment. But as I was saying, in talking about my path, what I really want to underline is this, paying attention to which questions you find yourself asking, and coming back to, over and over. So one exercise that we do with our students is that, we have them ask what we call them meaningless questions. And the idea of doing that is to take the pressure off, that, you don't have to ask a perfect question. You don't have to come up with like the most amazing thing right now to research. But we sort of give them a picture. So we give them a picture like this of like technology or something like that. And we just say, spend a couple minutes and just write down, as many questions as come to mind. And it's really no pressure. Just what is it that interests you? So to give some examples, someone looking at this, they could ask a number of different types of questions. They could ask questions about what's happening with that technology. What is that technology connecting to? How is it going about, translating some sort of visual information to help blind people see? And they could be really into the mechanics of it. They could end up being more curious about, what's going on in the brain, what is the neural basis of sight, et cetera. And so, these are different types of questions. Someone like me who gravitates more, more in the sort of social aspects, I might ask questions about like, what do they even mean to see? When we're saying we're helping them see, what does that even mean? Is it the same thing that we think of, those of us who are sighted? Is it something else? And then on the research and ethics side, in terms of how you, help participants, You might have a range of questions. Who's participating in these, in this research? Is it a wide range of different people? Are they, how are they making sure that the people taking part in this that their rights are respected, that they've given consent for what's going to happen? What happens afterwards, after this research? This is a big question coming up in neuroethics now about, what happens after you've tested one of these devices? Will the person still have access to it? Will you have restored some version of sight to someone only to have it taken away at some point? So I'm giving you these range of different questions just to say that um, over time, what you might start paying attention to is what types of questions got you most interested. And then do those types of exercises with yourself, and you can start seeing, well, within whether it's neuroscience or something else, what are the things you keep coming back to? For me, as I said, it was often what might be done to address mental health. And, these are just some of the issues in terms of with mental health, that, a 1 in 5 adults experience mental illness, but you end up having somewhere around 55% who don't receive treatment. And so that's where I became interested in whether digital mental health technology could help fill that gap. And there's these different types of digital mental health technology. Algorithms and AI is where I've been focusing, but of course, mental health apps. And the types of questions I might ask, to give an example, is with digital phenotyping. So most of us all now have a smartphone, and this was work that I've done over the years on smartphones, that they can gather a lot of information. This is amazing for research, honestly, because so many times before with research, when you would be studying someone who had mental illness, it was only when they were having a crisis or only when they were right in front of, their psychiatrist. And so a lot has not been understood about, what is the lead up, what might be the symptoms, as well as, what might be additional ways to diagnose. And from your smartphone, it can gather a lot of information, whether it's, location data, what your voice sounds like at any given time. When you're tapping on it, how fast are those taps? What kinds of reflexes do you seem to have? As well as the actual content of what you're doing. And what they can do is run these analyses to sort of type you, to try and figure out behavior, mood, cognition, with the hope of improved treatment and diagnosis. But as you might imagine, there are a number of, questions about this, about what happens with that data, what kind of privacy concerns might there be, whether it's being tested on enough different types of people that it can actually then be of benefit, and, whether it's people of different socioeconomic status, race, ethnicity, different language, and whether it's tested on enough different types of people, that it can actually help them. Informed consent, that they're collecting all this data. Do you actually have an understanding of what data is being collected and what they can do with it? And on the data front, I think more and more now people are aware of it, but, the data, um, even data that you may not think is particularly interesting, whether it's location, whether it's just sort of minor things that are popping up in your social media, they can be taken and analyzed. And beyond just mental health, they can be used to predict things. And one thing that you might be aware of, these are already being used in schools. So there's some schools that might collect data from people's IDs, for example, to try and find out who's a bigger risk of dropping out, or, who might have depression among the student body. And then you have these questions. How are they going to use that information? Is it going to be to help their students, or is it going to be to, unfortunately, to sort of, transition the students to some other part of the school where they might not get as much resources. There's also questions of, if we're delivering these kinds of beneficial technologies through smartphones, that there's some communities that don't have as much infrastructure, that, may not have high-speed connections or up-to-date tech to actually benefit from this. That people who are from low-income groups or marginalized groups might not have resources for access. But it's also who designs the tools. And that's why it's part of where I love these kinds of things like your organization is doing, IYNA, is because it's encouraging people from a lot of different, backgrounds, perspectives to become a part of designing digital tools, thinking through who are these actually designed for, who are they researched on, and then who can actually use them. And when I was looking at mental health apps, one thing to note is that there's the hardware kind of issues, so is the hardware going to work on different hair types, on, facial recognition? Is it going to work on different skin tones? But there's also these more subtle ways that if you have a mental health app, is it designed in ways that are accessible for a range of people? That, some apps that were targeted at women were super pink and girly. And that doesn't necessarily apply for almost, across, people who identify as women, not even to say sort of who might it then be excluding. We certainly, in talking through, the ways that people use mental health apps, found that, some people, even for meditation apps would say that's for someone who's wealthier than me, that's for like yoga moms, not for me. And so, these are kind of the range of different types of issues, but they're the kinds of things in terms of neuroethics that end up being questions that become part of, what you ask in terms of, who is going to benefit, from these practices, from this technologies, who might get excluded, and how can we address that? So I will leave it at that, and look forward to talking more.
Thank you so much, Nicole. That was an incredible presentation. You've also given us so much to think about, especially when it comes to all these types of digital technology and some of the implications that come along with that. All right, Sarah, do you want to share your screen now, or if you want to talk a little bit more about your career journey and experiences?
Yeah, that was great. I want to say thanks to Irene and the organization for inviting me to come. And wow, that was cool. I mean, so often we don't even get to know each other's stories. So thank you for letting me hear that, Nicole. That was amazing. Let me just find my slides. Hold on just a second. There. Everybody can see that?
Yep, all clear.
Yeah, so it's incredibly fun to get to come and talk about how I got here and what I'm doing. Always fun. I just put up a bunch of slides on the first one just to think about what neuroethics is and kind of how people visualize what that is. So looking in at the brain, thinking about justice in the brain. The thing on the right is a little trying to from our group trying to get straight about different aspects of agency when you're using a neural device. And then at the bottom right, one of the brain-computer interface, implantable brain-computer interface research participants using this robotic arm. And that's one of the kinds of studies that my group has really been involved in a lot. So first, a little bit about me. I'm based in a philosophy department at the University of Washington. It's a philosophy department that we kind of pride ourselves or brand ourselves as doing engaged philosophy. So it's not just me doing neuroethics, working very closely with neuroscientists and neural engineers, but also my colleagues. So I have a colleague who works on climate justice and environmental ethics issues and works very closely with geoengineers and talking through policy in that realm. I have colleagues who work really closely with people looking at immigration policy and trying to make arguments to influence that. We're a philosophy department that does some abstract work, but likes to have that abstract work be in service of really trying to make a difference in the world. And then Another home of mine is in the disability studies program. And probably as I talk, you'll see that that's a central part of how I think about this work, which is always trying to um, push back on ableism that's rampant through our world and try to make sure that disabled people's voices are heard, and to understand that the things that non-disabled people see as vast problems and tragedies often are not that, or as Nicole was saying, are just more complicated, right? They're not always just internal, but they're about a whole social circumstance or setting, and trying to widen our scope so that we can see a broader picture and then have many more things that we could intervene on to try to improve well-being for people. And then the third thing in that left-hand column is a project I've been involved in. I'll say a little bit about more later, looking at leadership in the equitable and ethical design for STEM. So this is a project, we call it Lead for STEM. It's spread across multiple institutions. Jenny Reardon at Santa Cruz is our main PI. But there are plenty of other wonderful people involved, including Mildred Cho, who's at Stanford with Nicole. And the aim is to think about lots of ethics integration projects and calls that are out there now from big funding agencies like the NIH or NSF. They'll offer some funding and say we need to embed ethics or integrate ethics, but there's not a lot of detail about how that ought to be done, what exactly we're aiming for, other than more ethical science, right? But what does that look like in practice? How do you evaluate it? How do you know if it works? Thinking through power dynamics and that kind of thing is all part of that project. And then on my other side, I've been working with the Center for Neurotechnology here. It was an NSF funded center that went on for a long time. I'll talk more about that in the coming slides. And from that, I got to know my very close colleague, Erin Klein, who's a neurologist and a PhD in philosophy. And we have worked to build this neuroethics research group here at UW, where we're both helping with the Center for Neurotechnology, but then also doing our own NIH-funded research. So how did I get here? Let's take it back a little ways. I thought I would start actually in high school. You all are probably older than that, but I found this letter when my parents moved out to be in Seattle, where I am. They were cleaning out things in their house that I had written to myself. Until I found this letter, I would not have thought that I knew what philosophy was in high school, but I saw a film that really moved me. It was a high school film. It wasn't a fancy film. Okay, it was The Breakfast Club. I loved that film as a kid. And I came home and I didn't have anybody to talk to about it. My mind was just whirling and moving and so excited. And I wasn't normally a diarist or anything, but I wrote this 6-page handwritten letter to myself that in it contains like the problem of other minds and questions about identity and authenticity and questions about free will and multiple philosophical questions. And at the end, my favorite line is, "Oh, if only I could run away and be a philosopher and not have to worry about money." And I just think it's hilarious because now here I am. I get paid to be a philosopher. It's fantastic. But I never would have thought that I could go into philosophy at that age, right? If only I could run away and do that and not have to worry about money. Because I thought, well, I'm going to need to find a job, and there aren't lots of jobs just, advertised for philosophers. So I went to undergrad at the University of Illinois. I entered psychology. Like Nicole, I was following things that I was interested in too, thinking about why people think the way they do, how we work together or don't work together in various situations. And I was very quickly drawn to things that have to do with the brain. So and maybe my second year, I got into a neuropsychology lab that was doing work on learning and memory using an animal model with rabbits. And they had little head plugs and they, cords coming out of them. And we would teach them to do something, maybe lesion part of their brain so that they couldn't always learn to do that, trying to understand what's involved in learning and memory. And at the end of the studies, the rabbits would be sacrificed, right? We'd take their brains out, slice them, stain them, try to understand what was happening there. And I found that really, really interesting. And then one day, I was the assistant for somebody visiting, and we weren't able to anesthetize the animal the way that we typically did with an injection. And they needed to, because there was going to be some sort of problem with the stain that we used if we had that drug in the animal's body. And so the animal was put into a gas chamber and the rabbit screamed. And I just thought, I cannot do this. I can't be part of this. I had a very physical reaction to it. And the senior person who was visiting said, "It's all right. I know it's hard. You'll get used to it." And I thought, no, this is not a thing that anybody should ever get used to. We shouldn't do this. This is a problem. And I got out of the lab. And I think that experience really marked me in thinking there are lots of questions about ethics and research. I'm not against using animals in research, but boy, do we ever have to be really careful and thoughtful about the way that that's done. So having that kind of experience then pushed me into finding a different lab where I could work with humans and we weren't going to do any of these sacrifices. And, it was also neuropsychology. And so it's kind of funny now that as I come back in my faculty life, I am doing work that's very neuro-based, but I started there and then I took a path that went differently. So after I finished my undergrad, I took a little time off and traveled and worked abroad. And I came back thinking I wanted to go to grad school. And I had been a minor in philosophy, and it was a thing that I kept thinking about those questions. So even when I was in the human neuropsych lab, I'd be in there late at night analyzing data, talking to grad students, running subjects, waiting for them to finish. And I was always talking philosophy with the team there. There were just all these cool personal identity problems from Parfit's Reasons and Persons and other things that I was reading as a minor in philosophy. And so when I thought about going back to grad school, I realized this is the thing I really, really love. And I think I just want to try to do that. I went into it not knowing if I'd be able to get a job as a faculty member in philosophy, but I figured I could probably do it for PhD programs are about 5 years, for 5 or 6 years, and then I would do something else. I was pretty scrappy. I thought I'll just have other skills that I can use if I need to when I come out of it. And then I I feel like you have to be lucky to find a job in this field, but I got lucky and I absolutely love and adore my job. So early days, my first job, by the way, out of grad school was at Cal State Long Beach, and I did that 4 years and then moved here. And it's been such a great move because of having a law school and a med school and so much more research going on here. In my early days at UW, I worked with Wiley Burke's Center for Genomics and Healthcare Equality, which was an NSF or NHGRI funded center. My work there was trying to help with other philosophy or ethics-based scholars to kind of articulate our vision of what equity and justice was in this space, because people use those words a lot, but don't really know exactly what they mean or how they would implement them. And with Kelly Fryer Edwards and Suzanne Holland, I was working with the whole center trying to think. A lot of our work was based around thinking about genomics in tribal communities in Washington and Alaska. And so one of the things we talked about was thinking about responsive justice, where it wasn't just about distributing goods that are already there, thinking about recognition as part of justice. So understanding the different positionality of groups and marginalization of those groups and why they might not want to be involved in research, given histories of abuse in that context. And then also thinking about extra responsibilities of researchers to go out and try to understand those communities rather than just waiting to be approached or saying, well, we opened up our research and nobody signed up right from this community. And so they're just not interested. So we worked a lot with community-based participatory research. And again, that's been a thing that's been part of my work going forward. I think each step of the career trajectory feeds into the next thing that you can do. And that's certainly been the case in my world. I also was involved in the disability studies program. I think doing my dissertation work, I read a lot of pushback from, say, the deaf community about cochlear implants, which was a big question at the time. And I was really taken with the concerns around um, community and kind of linguistic minority preservation and thinking about support for such groups. Because if you think about just individual choices being made, which I'm all for individual choice too, but just individual choices being made without education about minority communities, there's a way in which we could eliminate certain kinds of communities over time. And so part of my work has always been trying to go to disabled groups to try to understand, what do these communities face? What are the biggest challenges? How do bioethicists try to take that into account? Yeah, and I say here, I'm not going to go into this for time, but I got really involved with an Ashley X case that happened at Seattle Children's Hospital, which was a hugely provocative case in Seattle and then across the country. And it was interesting to have this whole disability studies community behind me and do this kind of interdisciplinary work. And then the other thing is, I've always been really interested and trained in feminist philosophy. And in my early days at UW, I was starting a family. And I think one of the things I would say is, in my career, I take opportunities that are presented and try to find backup and help to make them work. But I also just try to philosophize about the things I am living. And so I was living early motherhood as a assistant professor, and I ended up writing and publishing several pieces on philosophy of motherhood and relational identity and relational autonomy in this context, because I was living it and I thought, I'm thinking about it philosophically and I might as well make use of this. Okay, then post tenure, the neural engineering folks at UW came to the program on ethics and said, we need somebody to work with us on ethics because we're trying to work up implantable brain-computer interfaces in people. And we know that the brain is a very sensitive part of our bodies, right? It's not the only thing that matters for our identity, but it's a central kind of seat and core part of how we understand ourselves as agents, enacting intentions on the world and doing things. And so I agreed to join them, and I thought it might just be a very short-term thing, and it ended up being 12 plus years and kind of taking over my whole research life. So again, you don't always know what you're getting into and what might open up. It's good to kind of jump in and take risks, I think. And in that center, they weren't quite sure how to structure things with the ethics group. Ethics could be a kind of education. It could be a thing at the side that's relevant to what's going on, but separate from it. But they made us into a research thrust, that's NSF language for engineering centers, with the intention to make sure that we were equal with other research thrusts. So the other research thrusts, especially toward the close of the NSF funding, were communication and interface. So this is like electrical engineering, hardware and material science for the electrodes, computational neuroscience, and experimental neuroscience. And ethics is then a co-equal thrust to that, which meant that we were integrated through all the other research projects, but we also had funding to do our own independent research. And I think that independence is really important for being seen as researchers rather than as kind of service providers for research. So our job is not just to guide and sort of assist with the research, but to do our own research within this space. And our charge was to build an ethics program that provides ethics education, offers support and collaboration, and identifies and pursues independent research on ethics matters. And we ended up working on questions about agency, identity, post-trial obligations, as Nicole was mentioning before, support structures, and questions now about what it is to be a brain pioneer. When we started, like they said, start an ethics program. Well, how? I'm not sure what this should be. I brought some grad students in. We did some reading about what had been done conceptually and philosophically around this kind of implantable BCI work. And then we went and interviewed the PIs who are part of the center. Just like if you're going to work with somebody, you need to know the details. What is going on in the labs? Like, what do you do? Why do you do that? What's it in service of? Do you see ethical issues that might be relevant to your work? And I just want to say, I think people like me or Nicole or others have training in humanities related work or legal studies or philosophy, but everybody has an ethics sense, right? Everybody has to build their ethical awareness. And so the people who are closest to it, working in the lab regularly, are the ones that we really wanted to say, what haunts you, right? What keeps you up worried? What, if you talk to your grandmother about what you're doing, what are the things that, you think as you're telling her, this could be a problem, or this might be something that we have to think about as we think where this technology goes. And then we also ask, how well prepared do you feel to manage those issues? And we ask them how they would like to work with us. And this is one thing that I've talked about in other presentations, I think was really interesting, that we offered them a kind of option where we would be a consult service, where they could call us in anytime they had issues, or we offered them something that would be much more deeply embedded in labs, where we'd put philosophers or humanists in labs with people. And they said about the latter, it might be a little creepy sometimes to have somebody always there watching what you're doing, but they thought the former, the purely consultational model, wouldn't be sufficient, because they said we probably would be hesitant to make use of it until we were pretty deeply down some pathway, and we don't know that we would always identify the issues that we should be looking for. So we want much earlier integration of the ethics team. And of course, putting somebody in every lab is really expensive, but we did end up putting a philosopher into one of the labs where he just had a desk there and he went there every day and had a full-on RA-ship, was part of the experiments that happened with a closed-loop DBS system. And it was fascinating. Wow, the sun finally came out, Seattle. Our other RAs would be attached to research groups, but not in the lab on a daily basis, but sort of attending lab meetings with some regularity. So I guess this is where I was saying this. This is Tim Brown, who's one of our fantastic grad students and now a faculty member here at UW in the medical school, in the lab working, playing with the toys. This is an EMG cuff on his arm, trying to understand it, how it works. So really going into the labs, meeting with lab groups. We would also run these dialogue workshops with the whole center, where it was kind of like doing a philosophy class, where we're trying to explicate and then surface the values that we go into our work with for neural engineers. So like, do you think of the people with spinal cord injury that you're trying to build a BCI for as broken, right? Do you think of them as having a life worth living? How do you understand the group of people that you're intending to help, and how do you understand the benefit that you're trying to bring there? And I think it was really valuable to have that discussion together so that we built kind of shared values through that dialogue. This is a huge group of people who I was putting these pictures together for a different talk earlier, but a huge group of postdocs, grad students, undergrads who've been part of our research, and then some are REU students, research experience for undergrads, who come and work in our lab or are part of the Center for Neurotechnology each summer and do an independent research project and then present a poster at the end of that. We meet weekly, we have a journal club, we present our works in progress if we're working on grants or papers or just trying to figure out analysis from some of the qualitative work that we've done. We do troubleshooting in projects, I can tell a story that's a positive one about putting people in labs, but there are a lot of ethics students who write to lab managers and then they never hear from them, or they say, yes, we'd love to have you be part of our lab, and then don't actually respond to the next set of emails. And so our group was often troubleshooting just how to make collaborations work, which collaboration sounds great, but it's hard work and it takes diligence. That says current project 2. I must have missed a slide. Sorry. Anyway, I want to tell you a little bit about one of our projects. Our first NIH grant project was about BCI and human agency. And we did a lot of qualitative interviews with people who are the first users of these devices in research studies about their sense of responsibility. So these are people who have, like the woman using the robotic arm on the cover slide I showed, who practice with the device, do visual imagery, and then can learn to control something like a computer cursor or a robotic arm just through their visual imagery, so through their thinking. And that's a pretty cool and amazing way to interact with the world. And so we would sit down and talk with them, observe some of the sessions, and then talk with them afterwards in interviews about their experience of doing that. So was it difficult? I was surprised to hear people say they felt really tired at the end of it, and not just kind of mentally fatigued, but their body felt tired, their muscles felt tired. They're not using their muscles, right? But something's happening when they're using their brains in order to direct this movement that leads to this experience of feeling tired, because it wasn't one person, it was kind of across the people doing this. We also asked them about their sense of responsibility. So if you're moving the robotic arm and you can reach and grasp something or touch the right place where a light shows, etc., that feels like people would say their body schema kind of extends and it feels like it's their movement, right? They're doing that. But then if it doesn't work, the surprising thing is they don't often feel like it's their responsibility. And so, partly what we're curious about is where is that responsibility gap, or what's happening given this mediation for the kind of action that they're performing. That moved us into this second research project that we're currently in, that we call Caring for Brain Pioneers, where we're sort of looking at the people who are doing this work, get called pioneers, call themselves pioneers in some cases, have formed the BCI Pioneers Coalition it's a small group of people, right, who have this strange experience of being in research studies and being able to control these things outside of themselves through thinking, through visual imagery alone. One really fascinating thing about that, I think, in some of our current work is just that typically in research studies, the researchers are the ones who get labeled as pioneers, right? Doing cutting edge, trailblazing work. They're first in their field, whatever. And it's pretty uncommon for research participants to be considered the pioneers, especially in the process of the study. So there are patient pioneers like Barney Clark, who had the first artificial heart, who maybe posthumously are understood as pioneers who are willing to take this risk to try something new. But in the world of active research, it's fairly uncommon for people who are the research participants to be labeled with that term. And so we're really interested in why that is. And I think some of it is they're much more active in their contribution to what the study is than somebody who is um, taking, let's say, taking a pharmaceutical, but kind of passively letting it work on their body, as opposed to very actively contributing to, trying to show that some kind of technology works in this way. So we have a study where we're just looking at this conceptual understanding of pioneering and what it means in this context, and also interviewing BCI pioneers to talk about their backup, right? So who are the people who help make it possible for them to do the work that they're doing? Um, because when we're talking about people who are wheelchair users, who need transportation access to get somewhere, the world is inaccessible, right? It's not designed for people with disabilities. What are the kind of support structures around them that make participation in that trial possible? And then trying to think through what are the ways that we design studies so that we're recognizing the full team that's involved in trying to make this kind of study a success. And I think, especially in the world of implantable neural devices, including deep brain stimulation studies, sometimes the study partner or the family member or caregiver is somebody who can really contribute epistemically to the study because they see things that are changing or are different with their loved one that the researcher may be less familiar with that person and less able to understand. So we're really trying to kind of apply what I would call a relational lens to this whole endeavor. And then it's so bright here suddenly. I'll just say one other project we're working on right now is through the brain and behavior quantification and synchronization, what we call barbecues funding, which is really about trying to stack up lots of data streams to understand more fully how you can understand the neural activity that's correlated with very particular behavior. So it might be with people on the epilepsy monitoring unit, or it might be with some healthy volunteers just with EEGs, but trying to very tightly synchronize, let's say, heart rate, breathing, sweat or skin conductance, eye tracking, other behavioral, maybe voice or other behavioral things, self-report on how people are feeling, and neural activity, so that you get these large stacks of data streams. And then you might be able to pick out things from them, especially in the neural activity, that are correlated with a particular feeling or behavior. And I think there are really fascinating things there around um, data privacy and questions about what we can infer about people from the data streams that can be collected. This is just experimental. It's not widely used, right? But that we're even putting so much money behind this, I think, is a fascinating move.
Yeah, with that, just to conclude our talk today, we hope everyone was able to take something away from this discussion. I'd also like to first thank Nicole and Sara for taking the time to share with us their personal and academic stories. It's incredible being able to hear from both of you and your experiences. So yeah, thanks everyone for joining us today, and we hope to see you next time. And thank you, Nicole and Sara, again. Bye, everyone.